This is the first of three videos that we plan. And the first deals with dowsing and its definition and a little bit about its history. The second deals with what you can do with it. The third deals with the implications and the meaning of it. And these will each be segments that are entire in themselves, hopefully. And I want to begin, first of all, with the definition that Webster gives to dowsing. Webster calls it the search for minerals or water with the use of a divining rod. Very simple. I think it's much more complicated than that, but that's what the popular conception is. And we will start from that and go into the timeless past. It starts really with Einstein, the great Einstein, who was a dowser himself, and he believed that it should be investigated. I came across a letter from him written to a doctor in Italy, and he was suggesting that his name be used, otherwise the authorities would not investigate it. So Einstein was both worldly wise and scientifically curious about an anomaly, because dowsing is an anomaly. It goes into the timeless past, and we don't know its origins. It probably began when man first walked the earth. But the fact is that there is a word for dowsing or dowser in every language. In Germany, it's Wunschelrute Geiger, a wishing rod goer. It's rather interesting because it brings out the character and nature of each of the nations that have it. In Dutch, it's Wickelrute Loper, which is more or less the same thing, with a intonation of witchcraft as well as wishing, the Wickel. And in France, it's radiesthésiste, which is a little more advanced. It's a modern term, a contemporary term, meaning the sensor of radiation. In Russia, it's Loza Iskadel. I don't know whether a Russian could understand me, but that's the way it appears to me when you spell it out. Loza is willow tree in Russian, and Iskadel is the searcher of, with. The implication is that you go around looking for water with a willow tree, a branch of a willow tree. Well, perhaps the most interesting definition is the Spanish one. And this actually appears in the manuals put out by the government in Spain. They say that a dowser is a Zahori, Zahori. That's undoubtedly a Moorish term. And the meaning of it is very interesting. It says a Zahori is the sensor of that which cannot be sensed, the viewer of the unviewable. That's the meaning of Zahori. And it must have come from North Africa and to North Africa from the Middle East, because we now know from the architecture that all the buildings, sacred buildings, of interest to the ancient peoples, especially in the Middle East, Egypt and Israel and so on, are all constructed over sites where there is running underground water. And that's what we are talking about. All these definitions of dowser involve the search for running underground water, not for the still waters, such as the pond behind me, but the running water generates positive ions and maybe some other energy which we're not familiar with, which a dowser can readily focus upon. And this is what we're going to talk about. What happened to this knowledge? It's only coming back as an avocation, as a hobby. I'll give you some of my own seminal incidents in the past, how it started me off as a hobby. But apparently, in ancient times, it was much, much more than that. The silver mines of Eastern Europe, for example, when they were developed by Germany, had on the staff a uniformed functionary whose duty it was to delineate the ore bodies that were to be dug out by the workers. Well, there is in the museum at Borkum in Germany a Meissen figurine of a German uniformed dowser, very trim in his green and white uniform, and he was holding a dowsing rod such as we would normally think of as a dowsing equipment, something like this. Of course, it was wood in those days. This is a plastic one. But eventually, in the 16th century, Elizabethan England needed minerals to develop its armaments. So Elizabeth naturally imported those who could find it. So the dowsers migrated to southwest England, to Cornwall from Germany. There, the word dowsing, from the Old High German, meaning to find or to locate, became corrupted, we think, who knows, to dowsing or dowsing. This became a printed word in the literature about 1820. So the term stuck, and it's called dowsing now. But again, I repeat that the word implies a great deal more than finding underground water, and the implications are quite exciting. If you stay with this and go through segments 2 and 3, I think you will share with me the vision of what this could do for the human race. Apparently, it's a gift not to any one person, but to all humanity. And why they don't use it is a great mystery. They don't know that it's there, so they don't think of using it. In this country, in the colonial period, there were many people who came from all parts of Europe with this knowledge. We know that is true because if you go into some of the houses, substantial houses too, that were built on the frontier, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and so forth, of the 13 colonies, you will find houses that were then built on the edge of the wilderness, away from the centers of Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and so on. But they were built with one thing in mind: water. They had to have it. So where was the source of water? It was underneath the house. Why? For protection. If you had to walk out of the house into the woods to get your water from a spring, it naturally was an exposure and you were at risk. And invariably, those of us who douse find that those wells, bricked up or stoned up in the cellar of these old houses, some of them have the Indian arrowhead sticking in the shutters still. It shows you the pressure that they were under and why they developed this thing as well as they did. But we can find these wells sited exactly over small running underground streams, which fits the pattern of dowsing as we understand it. Well, there must have been tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who developed that knowledge and who used it. And what has happened to it? Well, what happened to it was that we became very smart. We began to have land-grant colleges and universities, and they began to teach hydrology in both scientific terms, which excluded anything as an aberration, and that did not conform to something that was explainable under scientific terms. We run into this today. In fact, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit, but to make the point, some of the jobs that we get are because Earth scientists had failed to develop a water site for a large company. And more often than not, we can find the suitable supplies at less depth and more or less in close proximity to the dry hole or holes. This is a common experience, and we are rather amused by the fact that this occurs. The common talk about water in university circles, hydrologists think of it as existing in underground lakes, water tables, whereas we think of it, and I repeat again, underground running water, which fills those lakes and makes them possible. So if you know by the dowsing technique how to find the running underground streams, then you're never going to find a lake which sometimes isn't there or has run dry. The lake bed may be there, but not the water that once filled it. So I think that the whole business of that I'm proposed to talk about was delayed by technology, by business success, by the growth of the country in other ways. Perhaps now this ancient method is coming back to reinforce and to make explainable some of the things which are still puzzles in science. We leave some of that to the second and third segment. This is really just an introduction to dowsing as it is understood in the public mind, more or less. Well, I think that the early knowledge of dowsing and what we have missed can be exemplified by a wonderful story. It's absolutely true. In the about 1800, there was a man born in northern Vermont. Vermont was the 14th state to ratify the Constitution, and it was a howling wilderness in 1800. And in northern Vermont, it was even more of a howling wilderness. The more or less sophisticated part was down in the southern section. But in the northern section, in the town of Wheelock, where, by the way, a large acreage was sequestered for the use and development of Dartmouth College, there was born a man named Bezaleel Bemis, B-E-M-A-S. And this is a frontier story, and it shows you what can be done when you have to do it. That part of Vermont was filled, and still is to a degree, although a lot of it's been cut off, with wonderful red and white cedar growth. These are prime trees, even and beautiful to work with. As Bezaleel grew up, he learned how to bore out logs of cedar with an auger. I've seen one of those augers, and they must have been Olympians to do it. But they would turn this auger, twist it, and I guess they knew how to sharpen the cuchara, the bit at the end, and they would make a pipe that way. Well, he would bore out pipes. Mind you, this was around 1820. And he would sell them for 2 cents a foot. Now, you'd have to bring your own logs. But 2 cents a foot seems to me pretty good pay, perhaps in frontier terms, because who had money in those days? He also made wooden pumps. Those he made and sold for 5 cents. Well, actually he could make a pretty good living, and his territory began to expand, and it went from the north of Vermont to the south of Vermont. And he became known as a superb water technician, and he was a beautiful man, a spiritual man, who felt that his gift came from divine sources, so that he wanted to build clearings where man and beast could find water, fresh water, along the roads, primitive roads of that time. So he bought whiskey barrels, sawed them in half, and he dowsed and constructed pipes draining into the whiskey barrels so that you had turnouts all along the roads of early Vermont. He became known as Springwater Bemis. He had his troubles because he approached his congressman. Does this sound familiar? He approached his congressman for help in this. Of course, it was laughed at. So he went ahead and did it in the course of his business. If he had something as far south as Rutland or Burlington, Bennington, which was the extreme end of his property, he would plan ahead and make these cutouts, which must have been considerable labor, must have entailed considerable labor. So, Springwater Bemis was the inspiration. The story was true and an inspiration to those of us who founded the American Society of Dowsers many years ago. The interesting thing is that one of his wells, the All Right well in Danville, Vermont, is still functioning. We had to repair it not too long ago, but his legacy lives on. Well, that was the kind of rugged invention that many people relied upon for their living. And it's the kind of rugged inspiration and invention that got lost. Now, as I say, as a hobby, it's coming back to us. I'll give you I think in any interesting occupation, any worthwhile occupation, there's always a seminal incident, something that starts you off. And I'll give you mine in case it's of help in understanding this most curious and interesting subject. I was 11 years old, and my father had a place in northern Vermont for the family. We went there in the summers and summer vacation. It was wonderful, unspoiled and beautiful. And there were animals and all the things that children love. The outdoors and camping and so forth. Well, he wanted to build a second home on the edge of this extremely beautiful ridge. And it overlooked the Green Mountain Range, about 30 miles away. And had stone walls, cattle, sheep, and everything. So, to build a second home, there was no town water supply. He had to call on the man that did the work, we'll call him the descendant of Springwater Bemis. Well, his name was Mr. Allen, and he was a fine-looking old Scotsman with a guard's mustache. He stood erect, and he arrived in his square-shaped Chevy and drove down into the pasture and all of us trooped down there and stood around as he cut a wild apple switch from the stone wall. The apple tree is still there, going strong. And it was about 18 inches long in the shape of a V, very much like this plastic one. And he proceeded to grab both ends, just as I'm grabbing this one, very firmly in his hands. And very solemnly and professionally, he walked over the pasture there. And all of a sudden, the rod went down, pulled right down. I could see it. And everybody was suitably silent and waited for his pronouncement. Mr. Allen said to my father, A, there is plenty of water here for a house. B, it is of good quality. C, it will last. And they marked it with the stake, and my father did the honors with Mr. Allen. I forget what it was in those days. It was a good deal more than Springwater Venus was getting for his, I know that. And off they went, but I stayed behind. And when the grown-ups were out of the way, I picked up the wild apples branch that Mr. Allen had dropped, and I proceeded to walk over the place, and to my amazement, it pulled down also. But it didn't pull down with the force that I had seen it pull down in his hands. So I began to experiment. And I went behind the stone wall at some distance. And as I faced the stake and thought about it, again it would pull. Not very hard, but it would pull. Then I said, well, that's funny. How come it's still operating at a distance? Let's see if it will operate out of line of vision. So I went behind the knoll. It pulled again, as long as I thought about the stake, as long as I thought about it. So then I thought, well, let's see how far does distance make a change in this. So I went across the valley, which was a good height. And as long as I thought about Mr. Allen's sight, it would still pull. Well, right then and there, I didn't know it, but I had the explanation, which I now am satisfied with after all these years, of how this thing works, or at least the beginning of how it works. I was a reasonably intelligent kid, and I knew that in my class at Montgomery Country Day, there was nothing said in Science A, we'll call it, about such things as this, but I knew it was important. Somehow I knew it was important, and I had to do something about it myself to prove that it was important. Thank fortune, my parents in all the succeeding summer vacations never derided me and never discouraged me, because I would dig holes in the ground, I would bore holes in the ground. If I ran into rock, I would get quarter sticks of dynamite and blow up the rock. It's a miracle I got through that alive, but I was learning the trade and having fun at the same time. Of course, there were other things we did. There was plenty of baseball and camping and fishing and all that, but it was always a thing with me, and it continued with me when I grew up and had to go overseas with the service and all that kind of thing. I was still thinking about it. So what happened next? There's a series, a progression in this thing. What happened next? The kid from Philadelphia was sometimes called upon by the Yankees, I guess against their better judgment, but when they were desperate, if they were hauling water for 50 or 60 Holsteins and didn't know where it was going to come from, and they had heard that such and such a thing had happened in the water finding business with this kid, they would ask him to help them. So I tried, and some of them worked out, some of them didn't. But I kept trying. And I will never forget, this school teacher lived in a house in Williston, near Burlington, Vermont, a lovely old brick colonial house. And I didn't know her all that well, but I did know that she had a very ill mother that she was taking care of. That was her responsibility. And to do that, when she called up, she said, "I have a boarder, but my problem is no water. And I hear you're doing things in Craftsbury that develop good supplies for people around there, and I wondered if you could help me." "Oh," I said, "you're 30 miles away as the crow flies, on the other side of the Green Mountains, right over there by Burlington." I said, "Why don't you get a dowser to help you?" "Oh," she said, "I did. I had the old Frenchman come, and my lawn is full of dry holes." And, well, I said, "I tell you what to do." Now, I have no idea how I came to this conclusion. It just popped out. I said, "If you take a steel tape or a tape of some sort and measure 15 feet from your eastern wall, external wall, anywhere, just along that wall, measure 15 feet, and then make a point, a stake, and go down 17 and a half feet, you will find enough water to keep your boarder, who is paying you rent, and flush the toilet and wash the dishes." And how I knew that, I had no idea at the time. But she said, "Well, that's right beside some of the dry holes." I said, "Don't worry, just do as I say. And get your brother to come with a post hole digger, and that won't be very costly. You'll be able to do that, and he can do it in jig time." Well, the answer was that even though I had told her there would be water, I had told her that it would be very hard, but still it would work. So her brother came over. They found sufficient water to do what I said, flush the toilets and clean the dishes and keep the boarder and keep her mother. She didn't know what she was going to do with her mother otherwise. And it turned out to be heavily mineralized CaCO3, exactly as I had said. So this was a great step forward for me. How had I been able to do this at a distance? How had I been able to quantify, and save the day for this woman? My fame began to spread. And she said, "Well, I have a neighbor. You've done so well for me. He wants water for his new concrete block house. It's near me." And I said, "Well, all right, I think I better come over for this, man. I think it's tempting luck to do it at a distance a second time." So I went over and marked a place right outside his house, and he drilled. It was, again, a shallow well, and there was so much water came in that it collapsed the wall of his house. His cellar was flooded. So I learned to be rather careful and to designate exactly how much water I thought would be produced. So all these were really learning experiences, some of them fairly funny, some of them costly, some of them successful, but we learned something from them all the time. And it all adds up today to something quite special, I think. But meanwhile, very practical things were being accomplished. We go fast forward now, and this was some years after I'd gone into the service and out again, but I was still monkeying with this hobby, and I got a call. This time it was not just across the Green Mountain Range, but it was in Philadelphia, my home, and it was coming from Ecuador. And the voice at the other end said, "I am the president of the biggest company in Ecuador, 50% tax-wise. And I'd like you to come down and find water for one of our outfits. It happens to be the latest state-of-the-art brewery." And I said, "Well, I don't know that I could save you any money. How did you find out about me in the first place?" He said, "Well, we are a New York Stock Exchange company, and I phoned the chairman of the board, and he said, 'I don't know what a dowser is, but I'll go to the library in Westchester and look it up.'" So he did go to the library, and there, of all things, was my name in association with the American Society of Dowsers, which I was interested in helping at the time. So I said, "Well, you better send me a map and let me study the map a bit and see if I can save you money, because," "Oh," he said, "don't worry about it." He said, "Bring your wife down and we'll entertain you and we'll take you fishing in the Humboldt Current and so forth." I said, "No, I think you better send me a map to see if I can really do you any service." So he did, but it was the wrong map. It was the map of Ecuador instead of the plan of the plant, which is all you need. And eventually that came up, and I marked it with 9 different places. And I showed where the origin of the water was, coming from very deep in the ground, and how it flowed out from the point, the vertical rise, following the contour of the ground when it ran out of pressure. And it looked reasonably good to me, so I said, "Well, I think we can do you a service, and if you want, I'll come down." Well, the next thing I know, here were 2 tickets for my wife and myself, which was very fortuitous because she had lived 25 years in the Argentine and she could speak fluent Spanish. So it made it a very pleasant and easy trip from that point of view. So, nothing daunted, we went to Guayaquil, the capital, commercial capital, and the next morning the driver was there to take me out to the plant. Well, there was the voice at the other end of the telephone, and there was the German brewmaster. And I don't know what the German brewmaster thought about it, but there was not much he could do about it. He had to accept me. So we put on our hard hats, and I was asked if I needed a helicopter to look down on the... I said, "No, I don't need a helicopter." "Well, perhaps you'd like to go up into the Mulberry Tower." Well, the Mulberry Tower has one of these endless ladders that go up and up like that. You grab a rung and hope to goodness you can hang on. So they wanted me to go up the Mulberry ladder and view the property from the top, the Mulberry Tower. So I looked down on the property. It was about 12 hectares, about 20 acres, and it looked all right. I got a lot of banana leaves down there, and a lot of buildings, and the water treatment plant, and then the brewery itself. But I said, "Well, let's go try it." So the 3 of us went down to the downhill slope. Now this is important because if you get to the edge of a property, which is downhill, then all the vertical, all the horizontal streams of water will be issuing at that point, and you won't miss any. If you start at the uphill side, there's some that might originate within the property. So we started at one end of a concrete wall, walking along the top of the concrete wall, and we're going down to the other end. And the chairman, the president, walked first. I came second with the dowsing rod, and the third man was the brewmaster. And he had a clipboard and was taking notes. And whenever I came across a running underground stream, I would say, "Well, let's mark this with the blue chalk." Then I would proceed to give him the depth in meters, the flow in liters per second, and the quality. So you see, this was all a progression and a development from the earlier stories that I mentioned, where I was able to say 17 and a half feet to my friend in Williston is the depth, and you will have very hard water. I was qualifying and quantifying, so I'd gotten a little more precise at that as time went on. And it's a very simple matter of counting until your dowsing rod, really you, arrive at the correct decision. So we started in, as I say, at one end of that concrete walk, and we pushing our way through the banana leaves and so forth. And I marked one place and another place and another place with the blue chalk. And to the right of us was the brewery itself, with all its buildings and storage houses and all the rest of it. So about the third or fourth, I forget which, blue chalk marking, I heard behind me in broken English, "Mein Gott, he says it's just for it is on the map." I had forgotten all about the map that I had sent down, and here it was in the brewmaster's clipboard, and he was marking over the very same places that I had marked in Philadelphia. This was another step forward. I realized how accurate this could be at a distance. There wasn't a meter's difference. It wasn't a half a meter's difference, and we knew that that was accurate because the plan that I had marked in Philadelphia showed the various buildings, and it showed the water treatment plan and so forth, and where we were marking with blue chalk was exactly in relationship to the corner of the tool shed or whatever it was, as it was on the map. So the fact of the matter was we marked all 9, I think it was, and then they said the driller will be here, and we have instructed him to do exactly as you wish. Well, that was kind of a responsibility too. I didn't know much about the drilling business in those days, but I went to look at his rig, and then I talked to him, and I screwed up my courage to the sticking point, and I told him that I wanted him to drill to the exact places on this copy of the map that we had given to the company, and to take a sample of the water that he found there and a sample of the earth that he found there, and to give us an idea of the volume of the water that he might find at those depths. So he said that he would. So I was rather impressed with him. He was a burly man and seemed very straightforward. He was a Hungarian, which was rather interesting to find in Ecuador, but he said that he had been trained in the drilling school in the States, and that above all, he would drill at a slow rate. Now, the importance of that is that if he drilled with a rapid percussion, then 2 things can happen. He can either pulverize the limestone in the ground, which is what it was there, limestone, and make a cement with the water injection. It makes a very good cement, and that would plug up the little orifice of the water running in the ground, which runs about 2 miles an hour, and it would be a failure because the vein would be blocked. The other thing can happen, the shock of too rapid drilling can divert a vein and send it off into a new channel, and the driller would go to China and he would say that you missed it. There's nothing there. So he said that he would drill slowly and take care at each of the levels, and that pleased me a great deal. The next day, the company sent me off to Quito, which is one of the loveliest cities in the world, and there I had to do some more dowsing, for a branch that they had there and then returned. So a day or so later I came back, and they met me again 7 o'clock in the morning at the hotel and drove me out to the brewery, and I didn't know what to expect. So the brewmaster met me at the iron gate and took me to the office, and still no word. I was rather nervous, to put it mildly. Well, he said, "We got the water." I began to relax. There were several engineers in the room. I recall this was with some degree of pleasure. And one of them, I think he was in charge of the electrical system of the plant. He was a very bright young man, well trained. And he said, "Tiene suerte, you had luck." I said, "Nothing of the kind. I had no luck. I had many years of trial and error and experimenting, and there's no luck in it at all." So that really was a notch in my dowsing gun, to put it that way. But it also provided other experiences and learning experiences about the earth and how it functions, and in connection with the water sources, and also with people, how to deal with people. I learned so much. So a hobby that you love can produce the most amazing things if you let it. South America is very close at the top, and it wasn't long before the word had got out, and I found myself in Peru. I found myself later on in Colombia, and later on in Venezuela. And so it goes, and these people who sent for me all became friends. You may wonder whether I charged for this, because after all, it was an enormous benefit to a company, we'll say, that was paying $2 a cubic meter for very poor water, or who had to develop a water treatment plant. So I didn't charge, and they insisted. And I said, "Well, if you want to pay anything over and above my expenses, for myself and sometimes my wife, who usually went with me," I said, "you can contribute for every well that turns out to be a success." And as I said it would be, you can pay $1,000 to a charity. And I designated the charity. Well, I did raise a few $1,000s that way, and it was very satisfactory, not only to me but to them. And it's closed the circuit of giving and getting, and made the thing worthwhile. But I have refrained from making a commercial venture out of this. A, because I'm comfortable the way it is, and B, I didn't know enough about it in the beginning to make it a commercial venture, and it's just remained that way. I've just come back from an 8-day trip to Ecuador again. Now I'm working for the sons of these people, and they're just as good executives, good engineers, and good administrators as their fathers were, and they understand this thoroughly. And the whole picture has progressed, as I say. I keep using that word because before I went on this trip, I received a phone call from a young man in the seafood business. They were raising shrimp, lobster, and tilapia, St. Peter's fish. And that is number 2 after oil in export for the country, so it's an important business and a big business. So I said, "Well, my wife is ill. I cannot come, but if you will take a pair of coat hangers, and cut them in the shape of an L rod like that. Put a soda straw over the handle. You will have like a perfectly good set of dowsing rods. Here's a professional set, but you can make them out of coat hangers and they work just as well. And I said, if you will walk from where you are so many meters to the right, you will find that they will flip open like that. That's because you will be walking over a vein. You see, I have not enough confidence to be able to see these veins from a distance, even over the phone in a room that I had not been, or no map or anything. So my friend Ben proceeded to cut a pair of coat hangers like that and called me back, and he walked over the corner of the room or wherever it was, and they proceeded to flip out. So I said, I think you can do this, but let's do it over the phone. Send me the map of the area that you want water in. I will mark it and send it back by DHL courier service. I will keep a copy. Then you go to the site where the X is that I've marked with your coat hangers, and we will talk over the phone and see if you can find it precisely. Bear in mind that this is a narrow channel in the gravel at some depth, and then there may be several levels, and that we want a place where the drill stem will catch every level. You see the water comes up vertically like this, runs out of pressure, and makes a 90 and follows the contour of the land toward the sea. So sometimes the levels wander a bit. So if they're over each other, then you'll get them all. So he agreed to that, and I think he was pleased with his prowess with the coat hangers, and he's a very confident, as I found out later, very optimistic, cheerful, outgoing young man, and that contributed to the whole thing. But anyway, on the appointed day, right in my office, I had the map spread out, and the phone turned to speaker, so my hands were free, so that I could go over the map with the dowsing device if I needed it, and I could talk freely with him. So he called up with a handheld cellular phone from the site way out from the city near the sea where this operation was. It's a big operation, thousands of acres, and it was in a relatively dry area, as I found out later. So I said, are you near the X? And he said, I think I'm standing on it. Well, I said, I think you better move to the right 3 meters and then to the left. Do need small adjustments, you know? And I said, now where are you? And if you hold the rods and cross that site and then turn around and cross back, do both directions give you the reaction? And yes, they did. Well, I said, is there a difference as you walk one? Yes, a slight difference. I put the stake between them. That will mediate the difference between ending. It would minimize the error that you might be making. Because when you use the coat hangers, I'm not sure whether you're getting a reaction from the tip of the rod, or from your hands, or even your feet, you see. So we had him walk back and forth. This was over the speakerphone with all the engineers standing around. It must have been quite a scene down there. But if you can envisage that whole picture, he did put a stake in the ground. Now I said, I'm going to give you your clipboard there, I'm going to give you the depths and the volume of water at each depth and the quality. So he then took all that down. The whole thing maybe took 30-40 minutes on the overseas phone. Well, that was another wonderful experience, because when I got down there for this recent trip of 8 days, they took me to a well house and a pump which had been installed over this place. It was pumping continuously at 950 gallons a minute of pure water. There was no salt in it. And this was near the sea. It was in a dry area, relatively dry area. So my reputation was intact at that point because it worked over the phone, and everybody was properly enthusiastic. And most of all, I think I was. But anyway, I went on to do various jobs for them on site, and just as well as I did, because you leave a lot to chance when you do this at a distance. So I think that there's never an end to learning about this, and that from the very simple incident with Mr. Allen in the Vermont pasture to working over the phone at 3,000 miles distance is a huge learning experience, and I've enjoyed every step of the way. Let's say that let's consider, before we go on to the second segment that I mentioned in the very beginning, let's consider what could possibly make this possible. The seminal incident showed that there was a quantifying. Mr. Allen had said there would be enough water there. He said it would be good water. That's qualifying it. He said it will last. That's compressing time. He's going into the future. He's saying that it will be there when you build your house. That was not lost on me as an 11-year-old, but it was the real meaning and thrust of it didn't come into effect until many years later. The case of the school teacher developed the idea that there is no space or time. I began to realize that this was some years after the 11-year-old incident, but it began to impress on me the fact that there is no such thing as space and time when you're on this level of activity, and that you can go forward and backward perhaps in time as easily as Mr. Allen did in saying it will last. But you could probably do that with much more detail and say it will last with such and such a volume, or it will last until construction comes and drains this land. There's many ways, many shadings of prognosis, but that showed the compression of time and what possibly lay ahead. The brewery incident told me that there are many practical things that have to be paid attention to in conjunction with what is going on in the dowsing mode, and that without complete cooperation, you're not going to succeed. You're going to be branded a failure. So I've been very careful in talking with the drillers and the engineers in all cases after that. Well, I'm going to close this segment with a statement which is, I think, indicative of where we're going with this. I was on the platform once in a very nice mind and matter conference. And there were a lot of top-grade physicists and medical people there. And I don't know why I was there, but I was allowed to make a little paper. And one of the physicists he's a good, tough, hard-nosed physicist from California, Dr. Henry Stapp. And this is a statement that he made. He didn't particularly care for what I was saying then, but I was amazed to read it recently. Henry Stapp is quoted as saying, "The fundamental process of nature lies outside space-time, but generates events which can be located in space-time." I take it from that the physicists are beginning to get interested in the multi-level dimensions which we work with and are familiar with. And I take it that all of us humans, not just the dowsers who have experimented with this hobby, I take it that we are multi-dimensional beings. And in our second segment, we will talk more about it, especially in the third. But bear in mind, I think that we have the physical consciousness, the day-to-day consciousness, which we use in our work and anything that we do with our hands and so forth. Then I think there is above that a second level of our being, which we don't really, we're familiar with it. We will call it the emotional level, but we don't know how to control it really. And above that, there is perhaps a conceptual or a mental level, and we know still less about that. And above that, there is perhaps what we loosely call spiritual. And these four levels are interdependent and also they're individual and interdependent both. And I think that when we dowse, we do so on one or the other of these upper levels. But at the same time, our day-to-day consciousness is quite operative and in no way blocked out. We just are switching gears to higher gears, to higher ratios when we do this. More about this in our second segment. I'm sorry if this contained a lot of personal anecdotes, but it's the only way I know to explain what this thing called dowsing is, which is understood in all the countries of the world that I've been in, and for which there is a word in their language, which tells you a lot. So until we begin the second segment, we will say thank you, and it's nice to have been with you.